Dear Dr. Fenwick, good morning. Thank you very much for coming in to be a part of our podcast. And before we start, I just want to say that I'm a really from recently, I've been a huge fan of your work. I say from recently because I've found out about you and your research, your studies, perhaps like a month ago. And I'm pretty much convinced that I've seen like three-fourths of all of your videos, interviews on YouTube. I read your book, The Art of Dying, which has really wonderful, really fascinating stuff. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for that.
It's a pleasure. And thank you very much for the invite to be with you.
Yeah, you're really welcome. And like prior to actually going into all of the studies and research, I would like to ask you, like, first of all, what were the things that actually got you interested in neuropsychiatry, neuropsychology afterwards? And what were the things that led you towards investigating things that have to do with the end of life phenomena? How did it all begin for you?
It started way back in my 20s, and we were walking along a platform in London, tube platform, and there was a poster there, and it said philosophy classes. And my wife, I was with my wife then, and I said, should we go to philosophy classes? And she said, no, I want to go to pottery classes. So I said, okay, well, look, let's do philosophy classes first, and then we can do pottery next year. Well, we joined an organization called the School of Economic Science, which was a very restrictive organization in many ways, but very effective in introducing people to Ouspensky, Gurdjieff, and the whole idea of really esoteric thinking. And so I did that, and then on the seventh term, they sent us to a place called Collett House to be initiated in meditation by Shantananda Saraswati. It was his meditation that they were teaching, and he is the spiritual brother, if you like, because they came from the same Gurudev, of the Maharishi. So I didn't learn the Maharishi's meditation. I learned one from the same stable, as it were. And that was fascinating. I could see it was a very important technique. And because at that time I was training in electrophysiology and EEG, I managed to persuade George Harrison to come along and sit under my electrodes.
George Harrison.
So we had a Beatle.
Beatles, yes.
The Beatle. Yeah.
Okay.
He's really nice. And so he came in and he meditated. And by then I got a rough idea of what it should be like. And I could see the signature of meditation coming. And then that slowly transformed before my eyes into the signature of sleep. Mm-hmm. Now, what are you going to do? Because you've got a sleeping beetle next door who should be a meditating beetle. And it's really quite interesting. At any rate, I looked back through the records. We had enough. So I went in and woke him up and said, how was that, George? And he said, that was fantastic. Do you feel rested? I said, very. He said, yes, meditation is wonderful. Any chance that you went to sleep? Absolutely not. And it's very difficult to tell when you slip from meditation into sleep. But anyway, that's part of the journey, learning about meditation. And then I published a few papers on meditation, and we really went on from there. But I suppose the next step was the book on near-death experiences, which came out in 1972. And I saw this and I thought, that's interesting, because these suggest that there is, in fact, a transcendent aspect to people which one can actually know about. And so I wrote an article for the Times way back then. And following that, I got an invitation from the BBC, but by now it was actually, I did one in 83. And then I did one in 88. And the one in 88 was a QED program. And so that was all about near-death experiences. And following that, we got 2,000 letters. Do you remember letters? Things that you
yes.
open and read.
it's an old thing for my generation, but I remember them.
So we got a lot of data, huge data. And so we wrote our first book, The Truth in the Light, was on near-death experiences. And so I became to understand near-death experiences. And of course, I met a lot of people who had near-death experiences through this. And then later on, because of that, I started wondering whether, in fact, near-death actually had anything to do with the death process. And people said it did, people said it didn't. There's no evidence either way. So I thought the thing to do was to collect some evidence. Mm-hmm. So I applied for a grant actually to the BL Foundation, and they said yes, very nice. And so we started with two wonderful people, the palliative care nurses and the psychologist. We started a study in the south of England and in Rotterdam on the experiences of the dying. Now, okay, let's go back to, we published our first paper on that in 2003. So what on earth was the literature like then? Well, you could be an international, you could have a high international profile in this area and be very knowledgeable, because there are only about 2 papers.
Yeah, that was one of the things.
It wasn't difficult at all.
Yeah, that was one of the things that if I can interrupt you for a second, even today, I mean, you are the pioneer in regards to the study of end-of-life phenomena. What do you think are the reasons for the lack of studies, even back then in 2003, as you mentioned, and prior and today? Why is the scientific community so reserved about this topic?
I think it's very simple, because when we went into the hospices, we found that they were divided by a very sharp line. The medical people had people in there to help them die, keep them comfortable, organize their pain, and then they would die. The nurses, who were with the people a lot, saw the phenomena. And then we were beginning to get the idea that people might need help grieving. And so they were setting up grieving groups. And in these, of course, the phenomena would come out too. And so it's taken a long while for the medical fraternity of the hospices to accept this. They do now. And I was able to set up a meeting at the Royal Society of Medicine. Mm-hmm. And that was actually only 3 years ago. And that was pointing out that death was not a contraction, it was an expansion of consciousness. And so that showed really that we haven't got death fully in perspective at that time. I think we're getting better all the time at this. Mm. But so is there anything like near-death experiences and the death process itself? Yes, there are a lot of similarities. So people were right when they said near-death experiences are actually in some way like death.
In which ways?
In that you go into an area of love and light. In the near-death experience, you'll see dead relatives and spiritual beings. Spiritual beings not so common. As you die, you go into an area and come back from, and go into and come back from, and go into and come back from an area of love and light, where you'll see dead relatives and spiritual beings. In many ways, it's quite similar.
Yeah, like as far as I've understood from everything that I've read and everything that I watched, like the first step through the dying process that's basically taken or perhaps not taken, but that the dying person is led through is, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, premonitions. It's basically the person is in one way or another led to understand that that is coming in some way. Could you basically walk us a little bit through this and the following steps? And I'm really interested in like, how are these people actually, how could I explain this? How is it how is their attention diverted towards the fact that they are actually going to pass away? Which messages, how do they actually find out that this is going to happen?
Yes. Don't depend on premonitions because not everybody gets them. If you look up the Dalai Lama's book on dying, he says everybody knows 2 years before they're going to die that they're going to die. And if you read on a little bit, he'll tell you how, because their breathing changes and their thinking changes. Now, I don't know what that means, and I haven't been able to see that. But the premonitions that we have are really excellent. Usually come in dreams. I'll give you an example. A man, he was 26, I think, and he had 2 little kids and a wife. And one day he woke up and said to his wife, everything that I had to do here, really interesting statement, actually, I've done. And it's now time for me to die. Imagine your husband said that to you. It would freak you out.
It would be shocking.
And she said, don't worry, dear, you're probably a bit depressed. But he wasn't. And so he got all his affairs in order. And his wife, of course, was finding this all very difficult. And it must have been about 6 months later that his firm sent him on a trip to Africa in a private aircraft. And the private aircraft crashed and he was killed. Now, he actually had forewarning for that. But you can get dreams either about your own death or somebody's death very close to you, which are much shorter in time scale. There's a woman who had a dream that her daughter was run over just outside their house. And she woke up in a terrible state, as we would do. And she then noticed that in her bed was her daughter. And so she gave her daughter a big cuddle. And she says her daughter didn't seem to mind. And I think the daughter was 7 or 8, so she's quite old. And I can't say that she then forgot about it because it was a very powerful dream. But the daughter went to school, etc. But the next day, as she was on the pavement outside their house, she was struck by a car and killed. And it was exactly the same sorts of feelings that she had experienced in the dream. So this does seem to be a channel where you can collect information about either you going to die or other people going to die.
And the following step is if I can remember, if I can recall correctly, is basically visits by the dead relatives.
Yes, that's right. Deathbed visions. Now, this fortunately has been started to be researched by a lot of people. And from the 2 papers that there was in the book by Sir William Gowers in the late 20s, there are now many papers, deathbed visions, end-of-life experiences. There are a whole lot of synonyms for the phenomena, but basically it's this. Usually in about the last fortnight before you die, you may get a visit from a dead relative. Now, you have to say straight away, and it's very important that people are clear about this, is that we're talking about consciousness. And if we're talking about consciousness, science has very little to say. They're theories, but we don't know what it is. And so it's easy for the reductionists, the materialists, to say, oh, come on, it's created in the brain. It's all a brain function. When your brain goes, you go. Very simple,
hallucinations.
Very straightforward. Yeah, hallucinations, absolutely. They've got no veridical meaning at all. The other one is that, and this is William James, of course, that the brain acts as a filter, and consciousness is outside the brain. And there are a whole lot of theories in relationship to that, some of which it is one of the fundamental building blocks of the universe, etc., etc. But the point is, you have to be very clear where you stand on this. Because if you say it's made in the brain, then all these experiences are hallucinations. Okay, let's go home, guys. Let's talk about something really interesting now. On the other hand, if you think that it acts as a filter and what you're looking at is a transcendent realm in some way, then you don't go home. You say, God, that's really interesting. And this was the division in the hospices. I had a lovely visit to a hospice. And first of all, the nurses were very keen. They usually are. The medical director of this hospital was particularly unkeen. But the nurses persuaded him, and I said I'd give a little talk, and he needn't worry, etc., etc. He said, "That's all right, Peter. You won't find anything in my hospice." Then, in fact, we'd done a study in his hospice, and there were loads of people that had experiences like this. So I went through the data with the hospice. And at the end of it, he said, "Peter, are you sure you haven't got the data mixed up?"
Because of the sheer quantity of it.
Fascinating. Because the fact that these phenomena occurred in his hospice, he knew they didn't. So, but the fact that was a long time ago, about 12, 13 years ago. I mean, the field has moved on now. The medical profession are now up to speed with this and helping. And so when the deathbed visitors come, who are they? Relatives. We took 118 visions, and 25% were parents, then spiritual beings, then people who they saw, 17%, then people who they saw, but they weren't in a state to speak, so they held their hands out like that to them. And that was another 17%. And so it goes on down. And everybody wants to know is, do their cats and dogs come? I got sad news for you. Their cats and dogs are very rare. They're there, but they're rare. So you don't get many of those. So it's mainly family members and spiritual beings who come. And so that's the next step. And what do the deathbed visitors do? They sit on your bed. Why? Why on earth would this great hallucination, if you like the word, or visitor, if you prefer that word, plump themselves down on the bed beside you? Well, it's very, very easy. If you've had a child and it's in bed with a temperature, and what do? Sit on its bed and hold its hand. It's very comforting. So this is really a process of being comforted by these deathbed visions. How long do they last? Oh, they come and go, but usually more in the last fortnight. But there's another thing, and that is that all your listeners want to remember that they can be negotiated with. What does that mean? They tell you when they're going to die, they're going to come back and collect you. You can say, oh, please don't come back on Tuesday because my son is coming from America and he'll be here on Thursday. Please don't come back from me until I've had a chance to see them. And this will usually be granted. They won't come back. But if you were to say, there's a super hospice party on on Wednesday, and I want to go to that. No luck. So for really serious requests, they will delay your actual time of departure. So you need to remember that when you're dying. Then the next step, and this is actually part of the same step, is moving to an alternate reality. This is where near-death experiences and dying tend to overlap. The movement there is from the hospice into this realm. I first came across this when I was sitting on the beach in Jamaica, talking to a woman whose daughter had recently died. And she said, yes, what she said was she'd be in the hospice one moment, and then she would, quite often accompanied by a dead relative, she'd go into this new area, which was light and love, spiritual beings, and maybe some more dead relatives. So her daughter described it to her as an area to help you get used to what the dying process was going to be like. It's a sort of introduction. That's what they say. And certainly it's an enormously comforting vision or trip, whichever you prefer, to have had. And so that's really the next phase, going to a new reality. And then there are some phenomena which occur just before death and at the time of death itself. The next one is terminal lucidity. And this is what the Victorians called lightening up before death. I rather like that. And that's a very good term because that's exactly what you do. In the nursing homes that we went into and asked about the phenomenon when their inmates were dying, they would say that there were people there who had been in there for 3 or 4 years, were dementing when they came in, were quite demented. And by the time they coming up to death, they didn't even recognize their family. But in the terminal lucidity, the person will sit up in bed, recognize the family, quite often stretch out their arms, say goodbye to the family, and then lie back and die. And it's really interesting. And those are a sequence that they go through. Now, what interested me was that some people who've had strokes and not moved for a number of years will sit up and hold out their hands. And I've always said that this was a particularly interesting phenomenon, which is well within our reductionist science, and we ought to find out why, because it's taking memory out of the brain, possibly, and putting it somewhere else, because the brain's all shot up with dementia and so on.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So I always...
Yeah, please go forward.
There is a colleague of mine called Sam Parnia, and Sam has worked in this area. He's a very senior physician in a hospital in New York where he runs the intensive care unit. And he says we shouldn't be calling near-death experiences, but actual death experiences. And he's got a good reason for this. But the reason I'm bringing Sam in is that he and a whole lot of people like Bruce Grayson and others in the field decided to look at the question of terminal lucidity from a scientific point of view. So the National Institute of Health in America became interested, and they are going to fund a study into this. And so we'll see, because I think it'll tell us a lot about the brain and its mechanisms. Any rate, so that's terminal lucidity. And then you die. Okay. And dying is a fascinating thing. And I'd encourage all your listeners to think of it as really interesting. And I'd also, for various reasons I'll tell you about, think of it as the time of an expansion of consciousness, not a contraction. And so what I'm going to tell you about now is a really wonderful palliative care physician well, she's not a physician. She is a theologian, palliative care theologian in Switzerland. And her name is Monica Rentz. And I would invite all your listeners to look up her papers on the death process. And she divides it into three: pre-death, death, and post-death. Now, in our story, I'd got you as far as saying, and then they die. But in fact, the period before this, the pre-transition in her system is terribly important. And it's important because you have to do a whole lot of clearing of your psyche. Clear. What are you clearing? You're clearing your attachments. What are you attached to? Your family, your friends, your money, your house, all that sort of thing. It's got to be given up. And as they say, nothing can be taken with you, and the shroud has no pockets.
Yes.
There's nothing you can put in it. So get rid of it all. And that means that what goes on in your room with your family is terribly important. It's got to be a letting go, happy for you to go on, complete your journey, do move. And none of this, oh, please don't go, please stay. No, that doesn't help anybody.
Why is this important? You've emphasized this in a number of your talks in terms of letting go, in terms of, I believe the other term was to become non-dual. Why is this important for the person that's passing away, but also for the people, the relatives around him?
It's important for the person who's dying because he feels a tug not to go. And so he will try and resist the dying process rather than going with it. This can be very painful. And as you move towards it, and you don't want to move towards it, you don't want to go, you do want to stay, you don't want to go, you get very, very anxious. And it's called terminal anxiety. And the usual thing is to inject people with a drug like midazolam, and that puts you onto the borders of unconsciousness, and you die from there. I can only talk about myself, but I would much rather go through the whole process rather than have midazolam to take me out. And this is the same about going to Switzerland. You miss. Going to Switzerland means going to one of the clinics there where you can be killed, as it were. Lots of other words for that, like go be put to sleep, or you can decide that you want to die. In fact, Dignitas is one of the clinics there. And I think probably if I have an opportunity, I think I'd rather experience the whole thing the way that it probably will go, because it seems to go that way in most people. Anyway, the process that Monica Rentz talks about is this, first of all, this clearing process. If you succeed in that, then you don't get terminal anxiety. You don't need the midazolam. You can go onto the next stage, which she calls transition. And transition is when essentially you're lying there, but all the egoic structures in the brain collapsing. What am I saying? I'm saying brain function is changing so that your sense of I, your sense of me, starts to disintegrate. And so in this process, it can be disorientating. And then you go into the last one in her system, which is post-transition. And here you have, in fact, lost your egoic structures. And then, and you mentioned the word first, I'm going to follow up with it, you become non-dual. What on earth does non-duality mean? Non-duality is a very, very exciting state of consciousness that we're just beginning to explore, understand, and induce. What it means is that your egoic structures, and this can happen in healthy people too, and in people who seek it as well, and in people who don't seek it, it's there all around us. You join with the universe. It's just the universe. You are not separate from it in anything. For example, perception. Well, you know how you perceive. The light comes into the eye, the brain does its magic, and there in front of you is the world. Now, if you're non-dual, you see that that is not actually what happens at all. It is that awareness itself constructs the world, which is then for you to see. And so you talk about perception without a perceiver. And so you get all sorts of tautologies like this when you start going into the non-dual world, but it's really interesting. And there are courses now that you can take to become non-dual. I mean, it's fascinating.
I remember watching Alan Watts talking about his views through the perspectives actually of the Zen Buddhism. And one of the most fascinating metaphors, or not really metaphors, just a really good depiction of this unity throughout the universe is like basically looking at your hand and thinking of it in terms, okay, what are you seeing? Are you seeing the hand as separate from the space around it or what? And the thing is, like, the hand and the space around it aren't separated, because if there was no space around it, you wouldn't be able to see the hand at all. So basically, the two have to exist together in order for you to perceive it as all. And it's like the Zen Buddhism in and of itself, I hope to have more time sometime in the near future to read more about it. But the way that Alan Watts had described it is really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But you can experience this yourself. Just go on a course. Where are you going to get the course? Well, you obviously get them off the internet. And there are two which I would recommend. One by Jeffrey Martin. He's a researcher in California that's done a lot on it. And I'd read his book, actually, which is called The Finders. So Jeffrey Martin's book, The Finders, is a really good one if you're interested in non-duality. And the other one is Craig Hamilton. Craig Hamilton is sort of a new kid on the block in a way. I mean, I know he's been meditating for 40 years, etc., but he's now got his own courses. And he is doing something slightly different. What Jeffrey Martin does is there's a whole lot of mental states that you can get into, which encourage you to become non-dual. And in fact, he would see a direct relationship between the phenomena of his course and the arising of non-duality within you. For example, Douglas Harding, you might have heard of. He's the guy who wrote a book, What's It Like to Be Without a Head, or something like that. And the point is that if you really look, and he does this lovely, lovely test. Take your finger. Okay, there's your scientific investigation. Now point it to your legs. Look down. Can you see your legs? Yeah. Now point it to your stomach. Can you see your stomach? Yeah. Point it to your chest. Can you see it? Not so well, but yes, you can see it. Now point it to your head. What is there? Nothing. Just clear openness. So there are things like that that you learn about on Jeffrey's courses. On Craig's courses, which are slightly different, you may think I'm getting away from dying, but I'm not really, because non-duality is part of it. His argument is that why teach things which are parallel to non-duality, like Geoffrey Martin? Why not teach the phenomenology of non-duality itself? And that, I thought, was absolutely an excellent way of going about it. And in fact, I'm doing one of his courses now and enjoying it. They're relatively cheap. I think it was £200 or something, as opposed to some of Geoffrey's, which are very expensive. So if people want to do that, it is a meditation-packed course. You've got to enjoy meditating. If you don't do the course, because you'll just get irritated all the time. But if you enjoy meditation, there are loads of lovely meditations you can do, some of them guided. So it's a good way of heading towards non-duality. So let's go back to dying again. And I've taken this time out, to tell you about Monica Rentz and her way, and to the introducing you to non-duality as you die. But I want to get you to think about the death process, because it seems to me that there is, it's a rather dramatic way to put it, a fracturing of reality when you die. Now, what on earth does that mean? It means, in my view, that there are a lot of non-local phenomena. So what's a non-local phenomenon? Non-locality is a word which has been studied. I think it came over from America. And non-local means that the actual phenomena itself don't conform to time and space as we know it. So, for example, telepathy, that doesn't conform to space as we know it, and other parapsychological phenomena. Now, the whole death process is packed with them. So what are they? So we'll start with a simple one because it's easy to understand. It's what are called deathbed coincidences. What's a deathbed coincidence? It means that the dying person at the moment of death goes and visits a relative. Nice, easy thing to do, you would think.
Just go somewhere and visit.
Exactly. Can't even get out of bed, let alone see your relatives. But at the moment of death, you can. And you'll appear to the relative, and it depends totally on the time zone that you go into. If the people are asleep, it's one sort of thing. If they're awake, it's another. If they're awake, you may actually see a light, feel a hand, and the overwhelming knowledge that so-and-so has died gets you rushing to a telephone to find out, and you'll be told that this is what's happened. If it's in a dream, then it's really very different and very helpful to you. I think this story is a nice one because I like it. It's an Australian story, and no, it's not about the Aborigines. It's about a mother who is living in Australia, and her son is in the UK. Son is a great sailor, and she goes to bed, and when she is asleep, she has this dream. And the dream is, they're always described as very real, not like the ordinary dream at all. There's something very special about them. She sees her son walking towards her, dripping wet. Now that's interesting. Why should he be dripping wet? Well, he's a sailor, who knows? And as he gets closer, he transfigures. That means he changes into light, and light surrounds him, and light emanates from him as he gets closer and closer. And he says to his mother, "Don't worry, Mum, I'm okay." And then it fades. And she knows that he's died, But because of the time difference between Australia and the UK, she waits until some of his friends will be available. She rings them up to find out. Well, she tries him first, and nothing, of course. And she finds out that he was drowned at exactly that moment that he came to visit her. It's always at exactly that moment. We did a study of these, and it was the range was half an hour, but the majority occurred exactly at the time of death. So they're interesting phenomena. So now you can see we're into non-locality, aren't we? Because there the boundaries of space are constricted, and the form of space is also different. But you say, okay, dream imagery. Well, let's look at what else happens which are non-local. It's a very good description of light. Light which will transfigure the person, and light in the room. We've got some lovely accounts of candles burning, producing light in the room. There are no candles. There's just the impression that there is a candle which is burning. There is, as I say, they come transfigured by light all around them. And sometimes the room is flooded with light. Okay, so those are all non-local, some of the non-local phenomena. There are others, which are animals. Animals howl at a distance. We've got dogs that howl and howl at the moment that they die, their owners die. Cats aren't so demonstrative. They tend to get upset, but they don't howl and meow. What they do is clearly they're upset about something which is happening. So birds, a lot of bird stories. Bird stories are interesting because some of the ones we have indicate that the personality of the person is reflected in the personality of the bird. Like a wise guy comes back as a wise owl. And I got a nice story of this wonderful white owl seen in the village, never been seen before or since, arrived on the day he died, stayed in the tree in daylight so everybody could see it, very un-owlish behavior, and it disappeared at the time of his funeral. So that's an interesting story. These are stories, do you see? And shapes leaving the body. Yes. A lovely one, which I remember, is a pair of woodcutters who were cutting down trees. And unfortunately, one of the trees fell on his mate and killed him outright. He said as his mate was lying on the ground, he could see this shape coming out of him and disappearing. And shapes leaving the body are quite common. You see them in hospices as well. So that's another non-local phenomenon. And going back to deathbed coincidences, you can't hide from them. The person who's coming to visit you will visit you. Doesn't matter where you are, because we've got one from a submariner. He was under the sea when his relative came to see him, and of course came in a dream. And it was a sort of classical dream. And he didn't know anything about it for 3 weeks because they're never given bad news if you're under the sea, because it affects your functioning. When he got back to port, he was given the news that his grandmother had died. So you can't get away from it. So death is, think of it as a very interesting period. Now, I talked about Monica Arendt's non-duality, and I talked about being taken to this other reality, and the two now it all meet up very closely together. The idea of you becoming non-dual and becoming cosmic, if you like, in your experience when you die. So you can look forward to it.
Yeah, I mean,
And
that's...
how on earth do you look forward to it? Well, there's a very nice woman in palliative care physician in Canada who I met. Actually, there are two people from Canada who've got lovely ways of coping with these things. She teaches the dying when they say, I'm frightened of dying, etc., all about the near-death experience. And this is really where we started. Is it like the near-death experience? Yes, love, life, dead relatives certainly is. So that's one thing. So she teaches them that actually it's nothing to be frightened of. And she says they die much more calmly. And there's this other lovely Canadian palliative care nurse. Think Canada, think palliative care hospice in the outback, as it were. Difficult for relatives to get there. So she says, nobody in my hospice dies alone. Now, that's a ridiculous thing to say, because a lot of the relatives won't be able to get there. So how does she manage that? Well, she manages it and she just makes use of deathbed phenomena. She says to them, who do you think might pick you up if you were going to be picked up? And they say, I don't know, probably Mary, my cousin. We're very close to each other. She's died. She may come. And so the palliative care nurse says, okay. And every day when she goes in to see the patient, she says, has Mary come? And no, she hasn't. Then one day the patient says, yes, I saw Mary yesterday and we had a conversation. And she says, okay, next time Mary comes, go with her. And they die the next day. I mean, it's a wonderful way of coping with it.
It's a really amazing sort of say approach to dying, because I believe, like, in our culture, okay, we're not as Western of a culture as, for example, the UK, as the US is, but even in our culture, of course, like, that is seen as something that is horrifying, whereas through your, like, for the way that I experience your studies and your research and the way that you described all of these experiences from the dying and the people around them, it's something that basically shows that our approach and our views of the dying and the dying process have to change. And I think this is a really potent thought and a really important thing, especially today during the COVID crisis, when people are being left alone, where actually people aren't capable, aren't allowed to visit their dying relatives in the hospitals. How do you think that the whole approach from both the dying person, the people around him, and perhaps ultimately the hospital and the hospice, actually people that work there, has to change in order for the dying process to be a better one?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. We need to know what actually happens, not what we think happens, but what the data shows. The data is very reassuring. And one of the things that Monica Rentz has done is she's looked at the mental states, or the behavior, if you like, of people before they die, and the amount of fear and terminal panic which they have. And those who meditate are protected to some extent. Those with near-death experiences are protected. Those who pray, interestingly enough, are. And she's got one group, and this is the one that I really am interested in, those who are curious about the dying process. And I think it's terribly important that all your listeners should realize when they're dying, they should be curious about the process. Why? because it's very difficult to hold curiosity and fear at the same time. You can't actually do
Yes.
it because you would block yourself immediately. I'm not going to be curious about that. No thanks. Whereas, in fact, if you're curious, yeah, well, what's coming next? And I got a nice story about that for you. A friend of mine wanted to know all about death, and I told her. And she finally died, and I told her that she had to be curious all the time. And she went actually through the process very well. And her sister was really upset by her and wanted to know if she was still living or if she'd gone into oblivion or something. And so she said, I want a sign from you. Contact me, let me know. And so she, the next day, it was funeral day, when she was on her way to her funeral, there was a book lying on beside her, which she actually hadn't looked at, and I forget what it is. It's the no, I don't think I can remember. It's about three animals. And when she opened it, it opened at a page which had "Be Curious" on it. And it was this lovely picture of a lad and a couple of animals looking at a beautiful starry sky. So it was a real sign for her that, in fact, yeah, everything was okay.
Where do you hope that ultimately your studies and the studies that are being done right now, for example, as you mentioned prior, and this is something that's perhaps the most fascinating thing, the terminal lucidity part, where it seems as if the brain, which was, for lack of better words, decaying in many parts, suddenly comes to life for those brief moments and brings back people, not just in terms of movement, but as far as I remember, you were talking about people who have dementia, who have Alzheimer's, people who've forgotten about the people around them suddenly are becoming fully aware and fully present in the moment, recalling having vivid and lucid actual conversations. Where do you hope that the studies such as of this phenomena, such as of other phenomena that you have been talking about, will lead to? What do you believe is like the purposeful goal behind all of this?
Yes, well, I think that the first bit is the bit which you raised. Can science get a better understanding of the death experience? And terminal lucidity is certainly a way into this. This may show us that the brain has different functions which we haven't looked at yet. And it even raises the possibility that memory may be held outside the brain. So if the brain's decaying, the memories are intact somewhere else. And that would be non-reductionist and highly resisted by the scientific community. Although there is so much now going on which points much more to non-local phenomena and so on, that and the consciousness as not being a brain construct, it would be an exciting push in that direction. So that's one thing. The next thing is I'd like to see death taught in schools. There is something which is called existential fear of death. Existential fear of death. And existential fear of death is something we all have, whether we like it or not. And if anybody mentions death to us, it's okay, unless they talk about our own death.
Yes.
And Freud was one of the first people to notice that when we talk about death, we always talk about other people's and not our own. And this is called the Freudian paradox. And so the whole process of dying will be something which we talk about in Bhutan. a country just by the Himalayas. There, death is talked about all the time. It's normal. All the kids are seeing images of the dying and so on. And it is said that they lose their fear of death. And coming out of that country is the idea that you need to be reminded 5 times a day that you're going to die. And for your listeners, if they're interested, there's an app called We Croak. We Croak.
Okay.
And so it's free if you take the simple app. You can put it on your telephone and it will remind you 5 times a day that you're going to die. And so, like those people in Bhutan, you do actually lose your fear of death, and that means you're very different, because your whole view of the world becomes different, and it's different in this way. Look, I'm terrified of dying. I don't like to admit I'm terrified of dying. So what do? I collect loads of things, money. Well, you can imagine the sort of things you can collect. And sexual partners is another one, of course. So you collect loads and loads of things. And why? Because come 20 years, come 40 years, in some people's case, just 2 or 3 years, you're not going to be there. You don't see yourself as just a tenant in the world and a tenant for what you have. You see yourself as collecting it forever. And that's because your view of death is wrong. And the Dalai Lama has actually said something about this. He says those who don't accept death, they're a society which is more aggressive, because you can have enemies. You see, it really matters to you that you beat this guy or shout at him and so on, when in fact it's nothing at all. Or if it is, it's only transient. Okay, so he does a dodgy deal with you and takes half of your income.
Yeah.
Okay, well, he's going to die and you're going to die, and it's a different thing. But if you've got to get rid of your existential fear of death before you can lighten up and lead a different sort of life. So that, I think, is going to be very important, and that's teaching kids about death in school. And do you get opportunities? Yeah, of course you do. One of my grandsons, he was keeping hamsters, and they had a little run in the garden. One day a fox got into the run, bit their heads off. So now he's facing death. And tell him about it. Let him understand it. Let him know that he too will die sometime, not for a long time. And then have a little ritual to bury the hamsters and so on and things like that. I mean, you can think about it. But I hope all your listeners will go away and remember, be curious.
Be curious. And I would just like for us to end the conversation on this note. I believe that this view of death and this view of dying, about being curious about it, but also about reminding yourself that you will die, is a nice addition to the whole Stoic memento mori concept, where it's seen to actually live your life to the fullest, because you will die one day, but not to look at that as something that's, as separate from life itself, but as a part of the whole journey, metaphorical or literal one, if you will. And thank you very much for that. It's been a real revelation for me in this conversation that, that picture, I never managed to pronounce the author's name of the memento mori, like the skull, decaying flower, and also like the small clock. I don't know the English word for it. This is a really nice additional perspective to the point of, okay, live your life to the fullest in terms of gratitude for the life, but also in terms of knowing that, hey, that is there, and we should be curious about it, not afraid of it.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me on. And thank you for that wonderful summary. You summarized it just perfectly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Fenwick. I hope that you have a really nice weekend, and I hope to talk to you sometime soon the next time.
Okay, thank you.